Good evening. I'm Dave Kuhlman. In my day job, I'm a senior partner at a firm called Lotus Blue Consulting, but it is my great privilege to be the chair of the governing board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. What a great day we've had today. It was a great discussion. I know I learned a lot, and it's a great start to the Conference for the Human Pathogens Project, and we're so grateful you're here. It is my honor tonight to introduce you to this evening's keynote speaker, Dr. Zeynep Tufekci. But before we do, I'd like to share with you a realization I had today, and it's actually a realization about the Bulletin. And it really was, I think, a realization about sort of what lies at the heart of what makes the Bulletin extraordinary. You know, at the Bulletin, we're the keepers of the doomsday clock, which is one of the great iconic images that galvanizes people's attention towards human-made existential threats. But I actually don't think that's the secret. We have an award-winning magazine, sorry, John Mecklin, where are you? With apologies, remarkable, but I don't think that's the secret. We have journalism that draws millions of people whenever there's a crisis in the world, and I don't think that's it. My realization this afternoon was that what lies at the heart of the Bulletin is a belief. And it's a belief that if you get knowledgeable, well-intentioned scientists and policy experts in a room, and you give them an opportunity to engage on the thorny and complicated issues that are associated, the blessings and the curses of modern science, that if you create an opportunity for them to engage both among themselves and with the public, that is our first best hope to secure our collective future. And so I don't want to go on without thanking all of you for coming and participating in that great effort, because that is really, in my view, the heart of what we do. And thank you in particular to Zeynep Tufekci, who is our keynote speaker this evening. And thank you for joining us tonight. Zeynep is the Craig Newmark Professor and Director of the Craig Newmark Center for Journalism, Ethics, and Security at the Columbia Journalism School. She writes regularly for the New York Times and the Atlantic. She is the author of Twitter and Tear Gas: The Power and Fragility of Networked Protest. She also has several TED Talks, which I would recommend. Her work focuses on social media, media ethics, and the social implications of new technologies, as well as societal challenges associated with the COVID-19 epidemic. In 2022, she was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for her columns on the pandemic and American culture, published in both the Atlantic and the New York Times. Zeynep has a way of presenting the issues and challenges we've discussed today in a manner that is both engaging and informative, and I look forward to hearing her remarks tonight. And I would also suggest to you that they represent an opportunity for us to explore the ways in which we might be able to characterize, package, and convey some of the ideas that are coming out in this conference tonight. So with that, Zeynep, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. I will first do the obligatory lower the microphone. It never fails. Second, I would like to thank the organizers for not putting me between people and their dinner, or people or their cocktails or dessert. That's sometimes what happens. You get to speak and people are waiting for you to get done so they can go have some food. I would like to thank them for not having that happen. I would also like to, thank, or not, let's see how you feel about it, the physicists who created the movement to try to warn about dangers of atom bombs, nuclear weapons, and all the need for the world to keep that under control, because that's the reason I'm not a physicist. I grew up in Turkey. I was one of those kids who was really into math and science, and like many kids who were into math and science, I thought I wanted to be a physicist because it sounded wonderful, unlocking secrets of the universe and finding all those things. And again, I was in Turkey, and this is a child speaking, and I only spoke Turkish, so I didn't really read all the history. I came upon what I would call the atom bomb problem that I think a lot of children who decide they're going to grow up being physicists encounter. And I thought, there's too much ethical burdens associated with being a physicist. This is so difficult. I don't think I want this. So I got into things like computer science or writing about pandemic and all the other things instead of physics. So that's a very, for me, interesting full circle to come to address this organization once again on a topic of great risk that comes from the great benefit that we also get from advances in science. Biology is not the first field, obviously. Physics was the first big one that came to light with how much science could help, heal, empower people, but also it came with real power. And one of the things I think about when I think about nuclear weapons is an essay by George Orwell that's not very well known, unlike his many other work, where he envisions the nuclear world. And he thinks that this will be the end of anti-colonial struggles because the big powers, U.S., Soviet Union back then, a few big European powers, they will have nuclear weapons, and no colonial nation will be able to fight for their freedom because they will be nuked. He thought that's it. Now, we know that didn't happen. That did not happen. World War II, the post-World War II period, saw a huge amount of anti-colonial resistance and many countries becoming newly liberated from their colonial overlords. And one of the reasons that didn't happen, that was alluded to in parts of the panels, was that atom bombs are clearly not as easy to proliferate, so we know that part. But that doesn't answer why they weren't used. And in retrospect, if I was telling my child self about dangers of weapons, perhaps I would have thought about things like, the firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo, which were just as dangerous in their death toll as the atom bomb had been. But there was something different about the atom bomb. It was science, the fruits of science, the fruits of intellect, the best of us, having come up with an understanding of the secrets of the universe that ended up turning on ourselves under these conditions. And whatever else you may have thought about, in comparison to other horrors of World War II, it became clear that there was a massive, justified, understood revulsion against the idea of using the fruits of science for mass murder in that sense. And physicists led the way. Physicists who had worked on the atom bomb even joined this movement to say, we need to draw that line. And it became, so far, knock on some wood you find, it became unpalatable to use nuclear weapons. This whole tactical versus strategic versus this or that did not matter. The world that George Orwell envisioned, where the big powers would use smaller nukes to kill and terrorize anti-colonial struggles, did not happen. That was not just the Anti-Proliferation Treaty. That was a political line that got drawn by the public with the leadership of scientists and politicians, so they could not use it and remain in the family of nations, remain and retain the legitimacy in their own nation. I hope this does not change. This is not some law that's written in some stone that can't be changed. But that's what stopped it. It wasn't because there have been other wars, there has been mass murder, there have been all sorts of atrocities. So I don't have some, naive and optimistic view of it. But one existential danger so far has been kept in check through what the public has believed was an unacceptable use. So why does this apply to this question now? Well, partly because we had a pandemic, and the question of the origin of the pandemic has been completely wrapped into the biosafety question. Now, obviously, this is not the first pandemic we had. This is unlikely to be the last pandemic we had. And obviously, I don't need to tell a room full of many scientists that zoonotic spillovers are a common way in which pandemics spread or happen. This is historically not some unknown thing. But of course, we don't say we always had wars, therefore we don't care about nuclear weapons. We've always had pandemics, but we did not have the kind of biotechnology in labs we had until quite recently. So therefore, something has changed. We've always had wars, but once you have nuclear weapons as a tool of war, the concept of war fundamentally changes in what it represents as an existential risk. You have to also consider that. So, and unfortunately also, the question became wrapped up, at least in the United States, in the first year of the pandemic especially, with a president that wavered between declaring the pandemic not a thing to the fault of China, to the fault of not a thing again, to declaring it might have been all sorts of theories that we know made no sense, demonized scientists in China, and correctly created a lot of revulsion among sane scientists that this was the discourse that was happening to a question that we did not have an answer to. And I believe that led to a situation in which that we have seen in the history of science before of what I would call overclaiming, overcertainty, and overreaction that did not acknowledge the basic fact that we do not know how this pandemic started. We may never know how this pandemic started. In pandemic investigations or any outbreak investigations are complicated, complex, even under the best of conditions, with full transparency and a lot of effort. Sometimes we don't know. Instead of acknowledging this, we've had a concerted effort by a small group of scientists and journalists who were gullible, and some politicians who wanted to shut off the crazies and the lunacy, which I completely sympathize with, to a wave of overclaiming that we had an answer. And of course, again and again, it turned out we didn't have the answer. So we had waves of media where the media would go to bat and say, we finally have an answer. And then, of course, it would turn out we didn't have the answer, and the journalists were just being gullible to their sources. We had it with claims of dispositive evidence in preprints that didn't turn out to be dispositive evidence, and they weren't and couldn't have been. But the damage was done because journalists echoed these without being critical enough. And as a consequence of this, we are seeing an increasing percent of the global public, the US public, the American public, believe overwhelmingly that there is some knowledge that it did start from a lab. In fact, the numbers are so lopsided that it's kind of really unnerving. 60 to 70% of the US public, depending on the poll, believes we know it was a lab, whereas only 20% thinks there was no research involvement. There's a small group of people, down to 11%, who, like me, believe, well, we don't know. So what has happened is this effort to claim the mantle of science without the evidence to support that, and journalists going along with it, and some possibly well-meaning politicians going along with this, has created this very explosive situation where a large majority of the global public believes that this pandemic started in some lab or research incident, that they don't know the details. Now, you might be tempted to believe, well, the public believes creationism and all of that, and I hear that all the time. it is not that, because the science, the sort of belief in science has gone up. The idea that it might have started in a lab is because scientists have lost credibility on this question by 2 years of overclaiming, 3 years of overclaiming, claiming they were the science, censorship by social media companies and other media companies, newspaper articles and all sorts of major news articles, including very recently that made claims that did not turn out to be true or supported by the evidence. And even if you think that you're of the opinion that it's likely no research relationship, that's a fair opinion to have. People can have opinions. This is very, very dangerous for science. This is very dangerous for credibility of science, to have so much of the public believe that scientists are lying to them and covering up to them. And the idea that this is just the same kind of people who believe in creationists is just not true. I'm an academic. I talk to academics with PhDs and all sorts of high degrees who don't follow the few loud people on Twitter or don't really read the few newspaper articles. They're completely convinced the cover-up is deliberate because they're not stupid. They can see that there's been a concerted effort to deny one possibility as unscientific while pretending the other one has been proven. So they get suspicious. And then they start thinking, why are they doing this? And they incorrectly, in my view, conclude that's because it's a deliberate cover-up of a known fact rather than, no, it's because of the polarization in the first year and a few loud scientists circling the wagons and journalists parroting them rather than doing their job. And a lot of people being intimidated in the fields to speak out. Like, I think that is the truth. I don't think that there's a bunch of people who know something who are covering it up, but that's what it looks like from the outside. That's what it looks like to a lot of smart people. This is not just a bunch of creationists who believe anything. And you can see it in the poll numbers. And I think it would be dangerous for people to kind of assuage themselves that the poll numbers represent gullibility rather than distrust. And the pandemic has had a lot of issues with public health and science. And again, science increases trust, but not on this. This is very important. So this is the perception part of it. And I think it's very important for sane, sensible, logical scientists who are not of the let's say the loony crowd, the ones that are trying to get Anthony Fauci killed and the ones that sort of make it so that Ralph Barrett can't safely go to a restaurant, the ones that I oppose wholeheartedly. These people in this room, scientists everywhere, should take the microphone away from the people who are making those kinds of claims and who are being very unscientific and illogical and dangerous, in fact, to science. But they're thriving because of this vacuum. If one side is overclaiming and saying, we represent science, everybody else shut up, and if the people who kind of correctly say, look, we don't know, and the fact that it was plausible that we're wondering about this is enough to consider biosafety to be a major question, along with, of course, worrying about spillover risk from other situations. If we don't take up that space will be taken up by people who are saying things that are not scientific, that are not sane, and that are driven by political polarization. But if there's nobody else in the space, that's who speaks. And that's why I wanted to come here. When they invited me to speak here, I said, I have to speak because now, finally, a bunch of people who are concerned about biosafety, who are trying to say something, and who are taking it seriously, because it needs to be taken seriously. Now, in 1977, we had a H1N1 pandemic that was triggered by, almost certainly, a vaccine trial that had gone wrong. What had happened was there was some fears of another H1N1 like the 1918 pandemic. And scientists, very understandably, started doing vaccine trials. And vaccine technology back then was less safe to say the least. There was a lot more potential for, let's say, escaping the safeguards. And it turns out that did happen. And then we had this pandemic that had very weird features. Okay, so we didn't know what had happened. The features were, it didn't affect people under over 26 as much. Why that age? And then you look at the genome, which was a newer technology back then, right? Now not as accessible as today. It's the same as the one 26, 27 years ago. That's not how evolution works. And there were some further tests on its sensitivity to temperature and things. And scientists quickly realized this is a vaccine gone wrong. But there was a 20 to 30 year silence that was deliberate. And it's been written about as scientists deciding at the time that they did not want to come out and say, yeah, a vaccine trial gone wrong caused a pandemic, because they were afraid that it would just damage the nascent cooperation on flu with Russia and China, back then Soviet Union and Communist China. So they kept quiet. And the topic just didn't come up much for 20-some years. And finally, one of the sort of very senior scientists said, yes, my counterpart wrote to me that it was a vaccine trial gone wrong. So we got it wasn't a secret, but it wasn't talked about on purpose. You have a similar crisis in 1989, the Sverdlovsk anthrax. That one is genuine lab leak. They forgot to change the filter, and it was a genuine bioweapon research, and then it leaked into the area, and then killed people and sickened hundreds. And it was, of course, covered up because it's the Soviet Union. And then some very high-level scientists, a couple from Harvard, very, very good people, they went there and concluded they bought the official story that it was meat poisoning, despite the fact that it didn't fit anything. And one of the things that really struck me about that case was the scientist in question who vouched for the Soviet Union. He was a very, very good scientist. He was not some gullible person. And he had been at the forefront of trying to stop the Reagan administration from going into bioweapons and weapons research. And some others have speculated at the time whether not a deliberate lie, but a motivated reasoning to not want to admit that this did not look like mass meat poisoning. In fact, next year, a Wall Street journalist, not a scientist, but a Wall Street journalist went to the same place, started digging, and immediately became clear that the official story had no legs. And it was, in fact, an anthrax outbreak from a lab. So it just took a journalist who was not going to be gullible and motivated to find out once he was able to do research. And this is at the time the Soviet Union's kind of collapsing, so all of a sudden you had the thing. So we've had incidents in the past where scientists have, I'm not saying insincere beliefs, but sincere beliefs that color how they think about, how they communicate about risks from their own field, which is very human, very understandable, but to the degree it may have worked to some level in the past, it absolutely backfires in the wrong direction now. It absolutely backfires. It threatens the credibility of science. If we had gone with what I thought was always the same thing to say, which is that, look, we don't know how this pandemic started. Yes, it started, the first known outbreak is in a wet market, but there's also a lab that deals with bats just a couple hundred yards from it. Who knows? A field researcher got infected and went to the market. They had live bats. They had bat samples. Bat samples can get pool and give rise to recombinations. So you might get infected. If you have bats, you might get infected by things you didn't even know they had. You don't have to be researching coronaviruses to get coronavirus from a live bat or a bunch of bat samples that recombine. So you could say all of these are possible because it really is weird that it happened in the city. But on the other hand, we also have a wet market, so it's absolutely possible that, there was some animal that was infected that came to the wet market and infected the human. It's also possible, like the way we have infected minks with the coronavirus pandemic. In Denmark, there was huge outbreaks of coronavirus among the COVID-19 among the minks, and they generated their own new variants, which then infected humans. Now, imagine if you didn't know the backstory, it would have looked like a mink origin, whereas, in fact, a person had first introduced them, but because minks are kept in a cramped condition and they have upper respiratory structures that are similar to humans, they generated variants and infected humans back. So it didn't originate from minks, but it would have looked like it if you had started the date, from the mink infection on. So it's possible that there was an animal outbreak, but that the intermediary animal was a human. There's nothing that says that this couldn't have been a bat-to-human direct infection. The intermediary animal is not some scientific requirement. In fact, a lot of scientists, including Ralph Baric, who studies coronaviruses, thinks we might have infected civets rather than civets being the intermediary. It's also possible. Pandemics are rare events. They chain together rare events. You cannot do regular probability. A villager from Yunnan might have traveled to Wuhan that week in November, whenever it started, and started the outbreak. Like, there's no way to rule out something really rare happening because spillovers happen all the time, pandemics do not. We have spillovers all the time. So which brings to my final question. So what do we take away from this? I think one thing we take away is that we should stop overclaiming. It is hurting science. It is hurting the credibility of science. It is making the public very, very suspicious of scientific research in this area. It is not good. The second thing is we should acknowledge the risks are real, and saying, oh, pandemics happened before sounds as stupid as it sounds because we did not have this technology before. When people go on TV and say it must be spillover because we always had pandemics, they do not sound convincing. Everybody knows we didn't have the technology before. Like, that doesn't make sense. So those are arguments we should not make. We should acknowledge that biotechnology has advanced to the degree we can do all sorts of things, some of which are potentially dangerous. So that means we have to think really carefully about the ones that could potentially trigger a pandemic, because that is not a minor risk. With SARS, too, this one, it escaped from Taiwan, BSL-3 lab. The researcher got infected. She kept it quiet, and they finally found it, by testing. And if it had been a new virus, we might have never known, because the only reason we know it happened is Taiwan's very transparent, very good for them. But the only reason we know this is because we caught it, because Taiwan was zero COVID, was testing like crazy, so could pinpoint what had happened. If she had been working with a pandemic potential pathogen, we never would have known, because, how are you going to know? You don't already have the test. And we know that a lot of these pandemic potential pathogens were being worked on BSL-2 and BSL-3 at best. So we have a real-life example of exactly how it could have happened. Is it proof? It is not. Do we have to acknowledge that it could have been? Yes, we need to. So what you do going forward, in my view, is we go back to what we should have said in the first place and say, yes, this technology is powerful. The science is powerful. It's great in some ways. We get a lot out of it. So we have to figure out what of the things we do are worth the scientific merit. So, for example, should we really be poking around all the bat caves to try to figure out all the potential? I'm not sure. There's a lot of argument that we should just surveil people for early outbreaks rather than introduce an extra risk by poking all the bats to try to collect their samples. Because in Wuhan, as far as I know, there's only a couple of places with bats, and those are all labs. It's not any of the markets. So it's an unnecessary level of risk. The second thing is, in the phrase, spillovers happen all the time, but pandemics do not. Pandemics seem to require, for very obvious reasons, density. You do not want the highest risk work in big cities. I'm not sure how this is so unclear yet, but it is. And I actually argued and had discussions and interviewed dozens of virologists on this topic. Almost all of them were very adamant that it couldn't have been a lab, even though I thought, like, you don't know. But some were willing to concede they couldn't rule it out. And I asked every one of them, I said, shouldn't some of the high-risk things, if you think there's scientific merit, shouldn't they be moved out of cities? Like, I'll buy the argument that you're doing something that is super essential. Why is your lab worker going home at night? Like, because we know from research, we know from investigations, most lab-acquired infections are not detected until testing. So if you don't know what you're testing for, you're not going to detect it. This is such a clear history. Lab accidents that infect people do not get detected until testing most of the time. Like, this is sort of this hard fact. So why is your lab worker going home at night? If it's that important, surely we can build labs of the highest quality somewhere, and you guys go spend a month in it. And everybody said, no. Now, I'm an academic. I live in New York. I understand. I do not want to move a month somewhere to do my IRB application either. Like, I get it. But maybe that would also make people think, am I doing this for the scientific merit, or am I trying to get a Nature Science Cell paper because they'll publish it? Right? If you had to do some extra work to prove that this is such essential work, perhaps it would align the incentives. Alison Young has a new book coming out. I haven't read it yet. It's coming out in a day or two. And one of the first things she revealed is that there was a lab incident with H5N1 that was engineered in Wisconsin, that University of Wisconsin, that the University of Wisconsin had promised they would alert public health authorities, and they did not. This is the United States. I know we like to point our fingers at China or this or that, but like in the United States, an engineered H5N1 lab accident where the hose disconnected did not get reported to the public health authorities despite promising to do so, and they let the worker quarantine at home, I believe. And if we know anything about, there's studies from the pandemic airborne transmission where like literally a 5-minute same room across 30 feet, I believe there's one in Korea, transmission. Like, this is not the kind of risk you take with an engineered H5N1, and yet they did. They didn't tell anyone till later. If U.S. universities are doing this, you can imagine in a place where the stakes are higher or more authoritarian, it might even be worse. We are this little away from an incident, hopefully not a pandemic, an outbreak, that is going to turn the entire public against all of virology. Right now, it's already 60%, 70%, very suspicious. One more incident where they believe this is not being disclosed properly, it's going to genuinely damage our ability to do the kind of science we should be doing, rather than what we should be doing now, which is reconsider what are we doing, what are the sort of safety standards we need to be doing, and how do we get, and this is sort of my plea to the people in the field. There are very few of them who have been outspoken. They have been attacked occasionally by their colleagues. There's a lot of circling the wagons and tribalism going on, and I understand. This is why I didn't want to become a physicist. It felt very heavy to consider such ethical things. But here we are. But it was the people who stood up, the people who spoke out, that ended up being the best face of that science to the world. The people circling the wagons ended up discrediting their own science, even if in the short term they can convince a journalist or two, or maybe win some Twitter tweets or whatever virality. In the long run, they damaged their own field. And it was the ones that stood up and spoke for science with credibility, with humility on what the risks were, and try to sort of say, how can we do this safer to benefit people while also curtailing these risks? Those are the ones that keep the credibility of the science going forward. So that's kind of my plea to the field to the degree we can make it. And a thank you to those few of you, some of you are in this room, who have managed to speak out despite all the pressure to conform and to sort of go along with the circling the wagons crowd. If I think it would have been a great loss if everybody had done so. And in the meantime, I think institutions like this, and a bunch of you work in these institutions, please, please, please take up that space that is now being occupied by people who are overclaiming with certainty, with a sense of tribalism, perhaps sincerely in the name of their science, but not really doing something in the good for in the long run. And they are empowering the very voices, the unscientific voices, the ones that are just motivated by polarization, that see bioweapons under every stone, like the ones that you see on Twitter, the ones you sometimes see on congressional hearings. That's what's empowering them. The fact that other people aren't speaking out, the legitimate institutions aren't stepping in. I applaud the WHO for refusing to say this is over and we're going to, not think about this anymore. They've been very clear that the question remains open. I applaud sort of the scientists who continue to do that. And again, the very thing that makes science so wonderful and powerful and so amazing and a miracle of sorts, I guess, to the degree you want to call it a miracle, I would call it a miracle, is the same thing that gives us this edge and this power, and not grappling with it does not make that edge go away. It just makes the public really afraid of it, and they have a point. And thank you.